Acanthopholis. It means spiny scales.
Yeah.
Just hearing that translation, you immediately get a picture of something, well, pretty extraordinary, don't you?
You really do.
Yeah,
And it's a perfect name for what we're digging into today.
right.
We're heading back, way back, to the late Cretaceous in England to explore Acanthopholis. It was an ankylosaurian dinosaur.
One of the armored ones?
Exactly. The armored type.
And we're really getting into the weeds here, looking at the actual science, not just, the stuff you see in kids' books. We've got the old scientific papers, the original descriptions, the arguments back and forth, and then there's this more recent review paper that really shook things up a bit.
It did. So if you're curious about paleontology,
Yeah.
how we, piece together these ancient animals from bits of bone,
Yeah.
and how our understanding actually changes over time, well, this should be pretty fascinating. We're hoping you get some real aha moments out of this.
Definitely. Okay, so where does this story actually start? It wasn't like a big university expedition finding the first bones, was it?
No, not at all. It was much more random, really. Around 1865, this commercial fossil collector, a guy named John Griffiths,
Okay.
he found some remains near Folkestone down in Kent, on the coast. He wasn't, a trained paleontologist, but he knew where to look for interesting fossils, things like osteoderms.
The bony armor plates?
That's them, yeah, bony plates from the skin.
So kind of like a fossil hunter selling his finds.
Pretty much. He sold some bits to a Dr. John Percy, who was actually a metallurgist.
A metallurgist. Interesting.
Yeah, but Percy recognized they were scientifically important, so he took them to Thomas Henry Huxley.
Ah, Huxley. Now that's a big name from that era of science. Darwin's bulldog and all that.
Exactly, a really major figure. And Huxley saw right away these fossils were something special. He actually paid Griffiths to go back and dig for more.
Really? So he funded the collecting?
He did, but the spot was, well, difficult. It was right between the high and low tide marks.
Oh, wow. So they'd be fighting the sea to dig?
Pretty much, yeah. Really challenging. But Griffiths kept at it, and he managed to find more bones, more armor pieces. Crucial stuff.
That's incredible dedication.
Yeah,
Battling the English Channel for fossils, and all this led to the official name.
it did. In 1867, Huxley published the description. He named the genus Acanthopholis, and the species Acanthopholis horridus.
Spiny scales.
Exactly. Acantha is Greek for spine or thorn. Pholis is scale.
And horridus.
Latin, meaning frightening or rough, probably referring to that impressive armor, gives you a vivid picture.
It really does. Rough, spiny scales. But wait, I think I've seen the species name spelled differently sometimes. Horrida.
Good catch. You're right. That came later in 1890. Arthur Smith Woodward, another paleontologist, he amended it, corrected it to Acanthopholis horrida.
Why the change?
Just a bit of grammatical housekeeping, really. The Greek word pholis, scale, is feminine. So the Latin species name ending needed to be feminine too, to match. One of those little details of scientific naming conventions.
Right, got it. Language rules even for dinosaurs. So these original defining fossils, the type specimens, where were they found, geologically speaking, and how old are we talking?
Okay, so the type specimens, they're technically called cotypes in this case, are cataloged as GSM 109045 through to GSM 109058. They came from the chalk group.
The chalk group, famous for the White Cliffs of Dover, right?
That's the one.
Okay.
And specifically, the part that dates to the Albian and Cenomanian stages. That puts them in the late Cretaceous, around 100 million years ago.
100 million years, okay. And what did these first fossils actually include?
It was a mix. Some teeth, part of the back of the skull, the base of cranium, one vertebra from the back, and importantly, those spikes and scutes, the armor plates.
Okay, so enough to name it, but maybe not a complete picture yet. It sounds like things got more complicated soon after, though. Other scientists started finding things they thought were Acanthopholis.
That's exactly what happened. Enter Harry Govier Seeley, another big name in paleontology back then. In the late 1860s, early 1870s, so pretty soon after Huxley's description, Seeley started looking at fossils found in a different formation, the Cambridge greensand.
Okay, different location, maybe a slightly different age.
Yeah, roughly contemporaneous, also Cretaceous, but a different depositional environment. And based on these greensand fossils, Seeley proposed several new species of Acanthopholis.
More spiny scale.
That's what he thought. He named Acanthopholis macrocircus, Acanthopholis platypus, and Acanthopholis stereocircus, first informally, then formally around 1871.
And these were based on, what, different bone shapes or armor types he found in the greensand?
Exactly. Each name was linked to specific sets of fossils held at the Cambridge Museum, the Sedgwick Museum. different catalog numbers for each supposed species. TMSM B55557 for Macrocircus, B555554 for Platypus, B55558 for Stereocircus, roughly speaking. He saw differences in vertebrae, limb bones, armor that made him think these were distinct species within the same genus.
So for a while there, it seemed like Acanthopholis was branching out, becoming a more diverse group.
It looked that way, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where the plot thickens. It wasn't quite so straightforward. Other paleontologists weren't necessarily all convinced, and even Seeley himself started, well, tinkering with his own classifications.
Oh, what did he do?
Well, for instance, he later took some of the bones he'd originally called Acanthopholis stereocircus and decided they actually belonged to a different genus altogether. He used them to name a species called Anoplosaurus major.
Okay, so he moved them out of Acanthopholis himself.
Right, and he also did some shuffling with another species, Anoplosaurus curtinotus, moving it into Acanthopholis as Acanthopholis curtinotus. So you'd see things were already getting a bit fluid.
Definitely sounds like it. The lines were blurring, even for the person who named them.
Exactly. And it didn't stop there. In 1879, Seeley created another new genus, Syngonosaurus, using some of the material he'd originally put under Acanthopholis macrosurface.
Wow, okay, so he was carving up his own earlier work quite a bit.
He was. And then, fast forward quite a bit to 1956, a German paleontologist, Friedrich von Huene. He took a look at Acanthopholis platypus and decided it wasn't an ankylosaur at all. He renamed it Macruosaurus platypus.
And what did Macruosaurus turn out to be?
Well, parts of it, especially the foot bones Seeley focused on, actually belonged to a sauropod.
A sauropod, like a long neck, mixed in with potential ankylosaur bits.
Exactly. So what started as one reasonably clear genus, Acanthopholis, was becoming a real tangle of names, reclassifications, and even mixed up fossils from totally different dinosaur groups.
That sounds incredibly confusing, trying to track what must have been a nightmare for paleontologists later on.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
Which leads us, thankfully, to a really crucial piece of work, that 1999 review you mentioned earlier, by Xavier Paredes-Superbiola and Paul Barrett.
Okay, the big reassessment.
The big reassessment. They went back and looked really carefully at all the fossil material that had ever been assigned to any Acanthopholis species.
And what was the verdict after they sifted through all that history and bone?
Well, their conclusion was pretty dramatic, really. They argued that all of those species Seeley had named for the Cambridge greensand, Macrocircus, Platypus, Stereocircus, and also Curtinotus, should be considered nomina dubia.
Nomen dubia. Okay, that sounds serious. What does that mean, practically speaking?
It literally translates to doubtful names.
Yeah.
In paleontology, it means the original fossil specimens used to define those species, the type material, weren't diagnostic enough. They couldn't be clearly distinguished as unique species.
Why not?
Because, as Paredes-Superbiola and Barrett found, the type specimens were often composites. They were mixtures of bones.
Ah, like the sauropod foot bone you mentioned.
Exactly like that example with A. platypus.
Yeah.
The original material for these species included bits that might be ankylosaur, yes, but also potentially bits from ornithopods, the iguanodon group and other things too, because the defining fossils were such a jumble and didn't clearly show features unique to one specific kind of animal.
You couldn't reliably say what those species names actually referred to.
Precisely. The names became doubtful because the foundation they were built on was just too shaky, too mixed up.
Wow, so that effectively wiped out most of the supposed Acanthopholis species in one go. A major revision.
A very major revision. And Paredes-Superbiola and Barrett also tidied up a couple of loose ends. They pointed out two other names Seeley had apparently written on museum labels but never actually published properly. Acanthopholis huyezi and Acanthopholis keeping keen.
Never published.
Nope. So in scientific terms, those are called nomina nuda naked names. They don't have any standing because they were never formally described and published according to the rules. Basically, invalid.
So this 1999 review really cleared the decks, didn't it? Leaving just the original Acanthopholis horrida, as potentially valid, maybe.
Essentially, yes. It simplified the picture dramatically, though perhaps disappointingly if you like the idea of lots of different English ankylosaurs.
But wait, you mentioned Syngosaurus? The one Seeley carved out of a Macrocircus, did that get thrown out too? Ah, good question. Initially, in that 1999 review, yes, Syngonosaurus was also considered dubious or potentially synonymous with Acanthopholis. But there's a twist.
Okay.
More recently, a 2020 study took another look.
Yeah.
And this newer research reevaluated the fossils assigned to Syngonosaurus and also another genus called Eucercosaurus. their conclusion was actually that these weren't ankylosaurs at all. Not ankylosaurs. What then?
They reinterpreted them as basal iguanodontians.
Iguanodontians. So part of the ornithopod group related to iguanodon.
Exactly. Early members of that lineage. So based on this different interpretation of the bones, Sigatosaurus was actually reinstated as a valid genus. But it's now understood to be an ornithopod, not an ankylosaur related to Acanthopholis.
Right. So Sigatosaurus got its name back, but ended up on a completely different branch of the dinosaur family tree.
Wow. Paleontology is definitely not static.
It certainly keeps you on your toes. And the Acanthopholis story doesn't quite end there. There have been more recent finds, too.
Yeah, between 2000 and 2001, a partial skeleton of a nodosaurid ankylosaur was discovered. Again in Kent, but from the Gault Formation this time.
A nodosaurid is, so the type of ankylosaur without a tail club, which fits with Acanthopholis, right?
That's right. Nodosaurids generally have shoulder spikes, but no big club on the tail.
And this partial skeleton, could it give us a clearer view of what Acanthopholis was really like compared to the older, maybe mixed-up material?
That's the hope. It's a much more associated skeleton, meaning the bones were likely from one individual. Interestingly, the bones show signs of shark scavenging.
Shark bites. So it probably died and ended up washed out to sea?
That's the interpretation, yeah. But despite the sharks, a good amount was recovered. Osteoderms, vertebrae, bits of the hip, the sacrum, parts of the limbs.
And is this new skeleton formally assigned to Acanthopholis horridus?
It's been tentatively or provisionally assigned to Acanthopholis. It's the best candidate we have right now for what the original A. horrida might have looked like in more detail.
Because it's from the right time, the right place, and the right kind of ankylosaur.
Pretty much. And this find is particularly great because you can actually go and see it. It's currently on display at the Maidstone Museum. It's on loan from a private collector.
That's fantastic, a chance to see a possible Acanthopholis. So, based on all this, the original finds and this newer skeleton, what can we say about its appearance? What did this spiny scale creature look like?
Okay, so we know it was a quadrupedal herbivore, definitely walked on four legs, munched plants.
Armored.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
definitely armored. As a nodosaurid, its armor would have included these oval keeled plates, meaning they had a ridge down the middle. They seem to have been set quite flat, almost horizontally across the body.
And the spiny part.
That likely comes from long spikes, particularly around the neck and shoulder region, maybe running back along the spine to some extent, really living up to the horridus part of the name.
Sounds formidable. How big was it?
Estimates vary a bit naturally, given the incomplete material, but generally somewhere in the range of 3 to maybe 5.5 meters long.
So roughly 10 to 18 feet, like a large car.
Yeah, pretty decent size. And weight estimates hover around maybe 380 kilograms, something like 840 pounds. So a fairly substantial, well-protected plant eater.
Okay. And how did its place in the grand dinosaur family tree change over time? You mentioned Huxley put it somewhere initially.
Right. Given what was known back in 1867, Huxley placed it in the Solidosauridae. Solidosaurus was another early British armored dinosaur, so it made sense at the time.
But that changed.
It did. As more ankylosaurs were found worldwide, understanding grew. In 1902, the famous Baron Franz Nafsa actually created a whole new family just for it, called Acanthophilidae.
Its own family.
For a while, yes. He even proposed a subfamily, Acanthophyllina. The family name later got a slight spelling correction to Acanthophilidae in 1928.
But we don't use Acanthophylidae today, do we?
No. With modern phylogenetic analysis, using computers to figure out evolutionary relationships based on anatomical features, it's now firmly placed within the Nodosauridae family.
So part of that major branch of ankylosaurs known for lacking tail clubs, but often having prominent shoulder spikes.
Exactly. It sits within Nodosauridae, which itself is within the larger group Ankylosauria. So its position is much clearer now, even if the specifics of the genus itself remain a bit hazy because of that history.
It really is quite a journey. From Huxley's initial description based on beach finds, through Seeley's burst of potentially dubious species, the big clear-out in '99, and now these newer finds offering fresh clues.
It's a fantastic example of how paleontology works, isn't it? It's not just about digging up bones. It's about interpretation, revaluation, debate, applying new techniques to old evidence.
This whole deep dive into Acanthopholis really underscores that our picture of the past is constantly being refined. It's not set in stone, pardon the pun.
Yeah. What started with Griffiths finding those odd bits on the shore
Yeah.
led to over a century of scientific work, confusion, clarification, and ongoing discovery.
So wrapping up, the main things to take away are Acanthopholis started with one species, A. horridus, found in England around 100 million years ago. Several other species named later, mostly by Seeley from the Cambridge greensand, are now considered nomina dubia, doubtful names, because their original fossils were mixed bags.
Composites.
So we're mainly left with the original species, possibly represented by that more recent partial skeleton from the Gault Formation, and it's classified as a notosaurid ankylosaur.
That's the gist of it. A spiky, armored herbivore whose scientific story is almost as complex as its armor might have been.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, this whole process?
It does. And perhaps it leaves you, the listener, with a thought. How many other things we think we know for sure in science today, based on the evidence we currently have, how many of those might be revised, reinterpreted, or maybe even overturned completely as we find new data or develop new ways of looking at things?
Yeah.
What other spiny scales of knowledge are out there, still a bit blurry, just waiting for us to get a clearer focus?
A really great question to end on. Thanks so much for walking us through that tangled history.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating case study.